Between the heavy pine and silver fir belts we find the big tree, the king of all the conifers in the world, the noblest of a noble race. It extends in a widely interrupted belt from a small grove in the middle of the fork of the American River to the head of Deer Creek, a distance of about 260 miles. The northern limit being near the 39th parallel, the southern a little below the 36th, and the elevation of the belt above the sea varies from 5,000 to 8,000 feet. From the American River Grove to the forest on Kings River, the species occurs only in small isolated groups, so sparsely distributed among the belts that there are gaps in it that are 40 to 60 miles wide. But from Kings River to southward to the Sequoia is not restricted but to mere groves, but it extends across the broad, rugged basins of Kawa and Tule rivers in the noble forests. A distance of nearly 70 miles, the continuity of this part of the belt being broken only by deep canyons. The Fresno, the largest of the northern groves, occupies an area of 3 or 4 square miles, a short distance to the southward of the famous Mariposa Grove. Along the beveled rim of the canyon to the south fork of Kings River there is a majestic forest of sequoia, about 6 miles long by 2 wide. This is the northernmost assemblages of big trees that may fairly be called a forest. Descending the perpetuous divide between the Kings River and Kauai, you may enter the grand forests that form to the main continuous portion of the belt. Advancing southward, the giants become more and more impressively exuberant, heaving their massive crowns into the sky from every ridge and slope and waving onward in graceful compliance with the complicated topography of the region. The finest of the Kauai section of the belt is on the broad ridge between Marble Creek and the Middle Fork, and extends from the granite headlands overlooking the hot plains to within a few miles of the cool glacial fountains of the summit peak. The extreme upper limit of the belt is reached between the middle and south forks of the Kauai at an elevation of 8,400 feet. But the finest block of big tree forests in the entire belt is on the north fork of Tule River. In the northern groves there are comparatively few young trees or saplings, but here for every old storm-stricken giant there are many in all glory of prime vigor, and for each of these a crowd of eager, hopeful young trees and saplings grow heartily on moraines, rocky ledges, along watercourses, and the moist alluvium of meadows, seemingly in hot pursuits of eternal life. But through the area occupied by the species increases so much from north to south, there is no marked increase in the size of the trees. A height of 275 feet and a diameter near the ground of about 20 feet is perhaps above the average size for the full-grown tree is favorably situated. Specimens 25 in diameter are not rare, and a few are nearly 300 feet high. In the Calaveras Grove there are 4 trees over 300 in height, the tallest of which by careful measurement is 325 feet. The largest I have yet met in the course of my explorations is a majestic old scarred monument in Kings River Forest. It is 35 feet 8 inches in diameter inside the bark, 4 feet from the ground. Under the most favorable conditions, these giants probably live 5,000 years or more, though few of even the larger trees are more than half as old. I never saw a big tree that died a natural death. Barring accidents, they seem to be immortal, being exempt from all the diseases that afflict and kill other trees. Unless destroyed by man, they live on indefinitely until burned, smashed by lightning, or cast down by storms, or by giving way of the ground on which they stand. The age of one of that was felled in Culveris Grove for the sake of having its stump for a dancing floor was about 1,300 years old, and its diameter measured across the stump 24 feet inside the bark. Another that was cut down in the Kings River forest was about the same size but nearly 1,000 years older, 2,200 years. Though not a very old looking tree, it was felled to procure a section for exposition, and thus an opportunity was given to count its annual rings of growth. The colossal sacred monument in the Kings River Forest mentioned above is burned half through. I spent a day in opportunity was making an estimate of its age, clearing away from the charred surface with an axe and carefully counting the annual rings with the aid of a pocket lens. The wood rings in the section I laid bare were so involved and contorted that in some places that I was not able to determine its age exactly, but I counted over 4,000 rings, which show that this tree was in its prime, swaying in the Syria winds when Christ walked the earth. No other tree in the world, as far as I know, has looked down on so many centuries as the sequoia, or opened such impressive and suggestive views into history. So exquisitely harmonious and finely balanced are even the mightiest of these monarchs of the woods in all their proportions and circumstances. There never is anything overgrown or monstrous looking about them. On coming in sight of them for the first time, you are likely to say, "Oh, see what beautiful, noble-looking trees are towering there, among the firs and pines, their grandeur being in the meantime in part invisible. But to the living eye it will be manifested sooner or later, stealing slowly on the senses, like the grandeur of Niagara, or the lofty Yosemite domes. Their great size is hidden from the inexpressed observer as long as they are seen at a distance in one harmonious view. When, however, you approach them and walk them round, you begin to wonder at their colossal size and seek a measuring rod. These giants bulge considerably at the base, but not more than is required for beauty and safety. And the only reason that this bulging seems in some cases excessive is only a comparatively small section of the shaft is seen at once in near views. One that I measured in Kings River Forest was 25 feet in diameter at the ground and 10 feet in diameter, 2,100 feet above the ground, showing that the taper of the trunk as a whole is charmingly fine, and when you stand back far enough to see the massive columns from the swelling instep to the lofty branch summit dissolving in a dome of verdure, you rejoice in an unrivaled display of combined grandeur and beauty. About 100 feet or more of the trunk is usually branchless, but its massive simplicity is relieved by the bark furrows, which instead of making an irregular network, run evenly parallel like the fluting of an architectural column, and to some extent by tufts of slender sprays that wave slightly in the winds and cast flecks of shade, seemingly to have been pined on here and there for the sake of beauty only. The young trees have simple, slender branches down to the ground, and put on with strict regularity, sharply aspiring to the top, horizontal about halfway down, and drooping in handsome curves at the base. By the time the sapling is 500 or 600 years old, this spiry, feathery, juvenile habit merges into the firm, rounded dome of the Middle Age, which in turn takes on the eccentric picturesques of old age. No other tree in the Sierra forest has foliage so densely massed or presents outlines so firmly drawn and so steadily subordinate to a special type. A knotty, ungovernable looking branch 5 to 8 feet thick may not be pushing out abruptly from the smooth trunk, as if sure to throw the regular curve into confusion. But as soon as the general outline is reached, and it stops short and dissolves in spreading bosses of law-abiding sprays, just as if every tree was growing beneath some huge invisible bell glass. Against two sides, every branch was being pressed and molded, yet somehow indulging in so many departures from the regular form that there is an appearance of freedom. The foliage of the saplings is dark bluish green in color, while the older trees ripen to a warm brownish yellow tint like Lepogradus. The bark is rich, cinnamon brown, purplish in young trees and the shady portions of old, while the ground is covered with brown leaves and burrs forming color masses of extraordinary richness, not to mention the flowers and underneath the rejoice about them in their seasons. Walk the sequoia woods at any time of year and you will say that they are the most beautiful and majestic on earth. Beautiful and impressive contrasts meet you everywhere. The colors of the trees and flowers, rocks and sky, light and shade, strength and frailty, endurance and evanescence, tangles of supple hazel bushes, tree pillars about as rigid as granite domes, roses and violets, the smallest of their kind, blooming around the feet of the giants and rungs of the slowly champaignia, where the sunbeams fall. Then in winter the trees themselves break forth in blue myriads of four-sided stamenate cones, crowd the ends of the slender sprays, coloring the whole trees, and when ripe dusting the air and the ground with golden pollen. The fertile cones are bright seed grass green, measuring about 2 inches in length by 1.5 in thickness, and are made up of about 40 firm rhomboidal scales densely packed with 5 to 8 seeds at the base of each. A single cone therefore contains from 200 to 300 seeds, which are about a fourth of an inch long by 3/16 wide, including a thin, flat margin that makes them go dancing and wavering. And other Sierra conifers produce nearly so many seeds. Millions are ripened annually by a single tree, and in fruitful year the product of one of the northern groves would be enough to plant all the mountain ranges of the world. Nature takes care, however, that not one seed in a million shall germinate at all, and of those that do, perhaps not 1 in 10,000 is suffered to live through the many vicissitudes of storm, drought, fire, and snow crushing that beset their youth. The Douglas squirrel is happy harvester of most of the sequoia cones. Out of every 100, perhaps 90 falls to his share, and unless cut off by his ivory sickle, they shake out their seeds and remain on the tree for many years. Watching the squirrels at their harvest work in Indian summer is one of the most delightful diversions imaginable. The woods are calm and ripe, colors are blazing in all their glory. The cone-laden trees stand motionless in the warm, hazy air, and you may see the crimson-crested woodcock, the prince of Sierra woodpeckers, drilling some dead limb or fallen trunk with his bill, and ever and anon filling the glens with his happy cackle. The hummingbird too dwells in these noble woods, and many, oftentimes be seen glancing among the flowers or resting, wing weary, on some leafless twig. But here also are the familiar robins of the orchard, and in the brown and grizzly bears so obviously fitted for these majestic solitudes, and the Douglas squirrel making more hilarious and exuberant vital stir than all the bears, birds, and hummingbird wings together. As soon as any accident happens to the crown of these sequoias, such as being stricken off by lightning or broken by storms, then the branches beneath the wound, no matter how situated, seem to be excited like a colony of bees that have lost their queen, and become anxious to repair the damage. Limbs that have grown outward for centuries at right angles to the trunk begin to turn upward to assist in making a new crown, each speedily assuming the special form of the true summits. Even in the case of mere stumps burned half through, some mere ornamental tuft will try to go aloft and do its best as a leader in forming a new head. Groups of 2 or 3 of these grand trees are often found standing close together, the seeds from which they spring heavily, having properly grown on ground cleared for the reception by the fall of a large tree of a former generation. These patches of fresh, mellow soil beside the upturned roots of the fallen giant may be 40 to 60 feet wide, and they are speedily occupied by seedlings. Out of these seedlings thickets, perhaps 2 or 3 may become trees, forming those close groups called 3 graces by 11 couples, etc. For even supposing that the trees would stand 20 or 30 feet apart while young, by the time they are fully grown, their trunks will touch and crowd against each other, and even appear as one in many cases. It is generally believed that this grand sequoia was far more widely distributed over the Sierra, but after long and careful study, I have come to the conclusion that it never was, at least since the close of the glacial period, because a diligent search along the margins of the grove and in the gaps between failed to reveal a single trace of its previous existence. Beyond its present bounds notwithstanding, I feel confident that if every sequoia in the range were to die today, numerous monuments of their existence would remain, and so imperishable as nature may as to be available for the student more than 10,000 years hence. In the first place, we notice that no species of coniferous tree in the range keeps its individuals so well together as sequoia. A mile is perhaps the greatest distance of any straggler from the main body, and all those stragglers that have come under my observation are young instead of old monumental trees, relics of a more extended growth. Again, sequoia trunks frequently endure for centuries after they fall. I have a specimen block cut from a fallen trunk, which is hardly distinguishable from specimens cut from living trees. Although the old trunk fragments from which it was derived was lain in the damp forest more than 380 years ago, probably thrice as long. The time measure in this case is simply this: when the ponderous trunk is to which the old vestige long fell, it sunk into the ground itself, thus making a long straight ditch. And in the middle of this ditch a silver fir is growing that is now more 4 feet in diameter, 380 years old, as determined by cutting it half through and counting the rings, thus demonstrating that the remnants of the trunk that made the ditch has laid on the ground for more than 380 years. For it is evident that to find the whole time we must add to the 380 years the time that the vanished portion of the trunk lay in the ditch before, being burned out of the way, plus the time that passed between the seed from which the monumental fir sprang fell into the prepared soil and took roots. Now, because sequoia trunks are never wholly consumed in one forest fire, and those fires reoccur only at considerable intervals, and because sequoia ditches, after being cleaned, are often left unplanted for centuries, it becomes evident that the trunk remnants in question may possibly have lain 1,000 years or more, and this instance is by no means a rare one. But admitting that upon those areas supposed to have been once covered with sequoia, every tree may have fallen, every trunk may have been burned or buried, leaving not a remnant. Any of the ditches made by fall of the ponderous trunks and by bowls made of the upturning roots would remain patent for thousands of years after the last vestige of the trunk that made them had vanished. Much of this ditch riding would no doubt be quickly affected by the flood action of overflowing stems and rain washing, but no inconsiderable portion would remain enduringly engraved on ridge tops beyond such destructive action. For where all the conditions are favorable, it is almost imperishable, now that these historic ditches and root bowls occur in all present sequoia groves. But as far as I have observed, not the faintest vestige of one presents itself out of them. We therefore conclude that the area covered by the sequoia has not been diminished during the last 8 or 10,000 years, and probably not at all in post-glacial times. Is the species verging to extinction? What are its relations? Climate, soil, and associated trees. All the phenomena bearing on these questions also throw light, as we shall endeavor to show, upon the peculiar distribution of the species, and sustain the conclusion already arrived at the question of the extension. In the northern groups, as we have seen, there are a few young trees or saplings growing up around the failing old ones to perpetuate the race, and in such as much as those aged sequoias, so nearly childless, are the only ones commonly known the species to observe, seem doomed to speedy extinction, as being nothing more than inspiring remnants vanquished in the so-called struggle for life by pines and firs that have driven it to its last stronghold. In moist glens where climate is exceptionally favorable, but the remnant vanquished in the so-called struggle of life for by pines and firs have been driven to its last stronghold. In moist glens where climate is exceptionally favorable, but the language of the majestic continuous forests of the south creates a very different impression. No tree of all the forest is more enduringly established in concordance with climate's language of the majestic continuous forests of the south creates a very different impression. No tree of all the forest is more enduring and established in concordance with climate and soil. It grows heartily everywhere on moraines and rocky ledges, along water courses, and in the deep, moist alluvium of meadows, with a multitude of seedlings and saplings crowding up around the aged, seemingly abundantly able to maintain the forests in prime vigor. For every storm-stricken tree there is one or more in all the glory of the prime, and for each of these many young trees and crowds of exuberant saplings, so that if they're all the trees of the section of the main